All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, perhaps good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. Welcome to our program tonight, Climate Disasters, Faithful Resilience, Preparing Your Congregation for Climate Disasters. My name is Avery Davis Lamb, and I am the Co-Executive Director of Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Today's program is part of our Climate Resilience Workshop series, in which we are asking the question, how can our churches be hubs of climate resilience in our communities, helping our neighbors weather the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis? You can watch previous recordings of our webinars on our YouTube page, which can be found at youtube.com/creationjusticeministries, or you can just search us in the search bar. And then when you're there, please subscribe so you can follow along with any future videos that we share. When we look around right now, we see climate disasters already unfolding in our world. It's not even what I've come to call climate disaster season. And yet we see record-breaking wildfires in New Mexico. We see devastating heat waves affecting our neighbors in India and Pakistan, and the oncoming start of likely another record-breaking hurricane season. The question before us today for this program is, in the face of these disasters, how can our communities of faith prepare so that we can be hubs of resilience, recovery, and restoration in the midst of climate disasters? To that end, we have two excellent guests with us here today. The Reverend Michael Malcolm will open us in prayer, and Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold will present on how you can prepare for climate disasters at your congregation. But before I hand it over to our speakers, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items for us all here today. Again, if you have not yet introduced yourself in the chat, please do so. We want to see everyone who's here today. You can see instructions for how to do that in the chat. We will have time for a short Q&A with Caroline at the end of the session today. You can drop your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We ask that you please use the Q&A function and not the chat function for questions. Feel free to engage in dialogue and conversation in the chat, but if you want a question answered, put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, it might get lost. And then finally, as you can see, this workshop is being recorded, and we will be sure to send a recording out to all participants via email next week. That recording will be public, so you can make it available to anyone in your communities who might want to see this. Now I'd like to introduce Reverend Michael Malcolm. The Reverend Michael Malcolm is the Executive Director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, and a licensed and ordained United Church of Christ minister. Reverend Malcolm is the former senior pastor of Rush Memorial Congregation, UCC in Atlanta, and he's the founder of the People's Justice Council, which is a 501c3 nonprofit focusing on environmental justice. Reverend Malcolm serves as the environmental justice minister for the Southeast Conference of the United Church of Christ. I've had the deep pleasure of working with Rev for the last 5 years, and I'm honored to call him a brother and a friend. His voice is one we desperately need to be listening to in this moment. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Reverend Michael Malcolm.
Brother Avery, it is certainly a blessing to be with you and Reverend Carolyn Hamilton-Arnold. We look forward to hearing from you. I don't have but a few minutes, and as I shared with the speaker as well as the host earlier, I've been in a conference all week, and so I'm a bit tired, and I have my wife here in DC with me. And so I'm going to take the rest of the evening spending time with her and trying to just kind of recharge my batteries. But I did want to drop this off with you. In my studies of Acts, the 17th chapter, I came across this narrative of the Apostle Paul as he is speaking before the Areopagus And when he's speaking before the Areopagus, he begins his statement with the men of Athens. And during his statement, he makes his thesis. And in his thesis, it says, in him we move, we live. In him we live, we move, and we have our being. And in that, beloved, it really centers us into our existence and how we ought to exist, or ask us the question even how we will exist in our relationship with Christ. Will we do the internal work that affects the the external appeal that has this eternal outlook? In essence, when it says we live, it talks about how we exist internally. We live, and then it talks about our external appeal and how we move. We ought to live in Christ. We ought to move in Christ, and then we ought to have our being in Christ. In essence, it's saying Christ shouldn't be something that we gather together to learn about, but we ought to inhabit the ways of Christ. And what are the ways of Christ? The ways of Christ are the same ways of the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, and that we live according to justice, righteousness, and walking humbly before our God. We speak up for those who are the least and the left out, those who are on the outside of the margin. And in doing so, we live, we move, and we have our being. Tonight, I'd like to pray that in our learning to be resilient and moving from this resilience to restoration, which Alabama Power, Interfaith Power and Light, as well as the People's Justice Council, have piloted this program that we worked with Creation Justice Ministries on, resilience to restoration, where we're getting congregations to move from a place of just being resilient. We want to help them to help their communities to be resilient in the midst of storms, in the midst of climate devastation, which we know will come, because in all actuality, we know not enough is being done. And if we face that reality, we know that that is happening. But we move from a place of just being resilient to a place of even restoring our communities. And when we restore our communities, we're not just talking about the physical restoration, but we're talking about that restoration that is spiritual, that restoration that is mental, that restoration that is physical, that social, that culture. We talk about that eternal restoration when we talk about restoration. And I'd like to pray that God gives us strength and courage to make those stances and stand for restoration. So if you will right now, pray with me. Eternal God, we thank you. We thank you for that work that has already been done. And we thank you for the internal work that we've experienced on our hearts that drive us to a point to be on this call, where we're looking for tools and we're looking for ways to apply these tools to help others and to help us into a better tomorrow. God, give us courage and give us strength to stand in these times. Give us courage and give us strength to stand out in these times, and give us courage and give us strength to stand with those who need us the most in these times. Eternal God, we ask that you would open our hearts and open our minds so that we might receive the lessons that you would have from that which give us life tonight. We thank you for all. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Rev. Thanks for dropping that off with us tonight. Thanks for being with us. And blessings on your ministry. Good to see you. All right, now I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold. Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold is the Associate Director for Domestic Disaster Response for Week of Compassion, which is the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Caroline's passion is for connecting people with the creative and recreative power of the living God through stories and faithful actions. And she believes a life of faith is about becoming part of God's ongoing work in the world. In her work, Caroline helps disciples in the United States and Canada prepare for and respond to natural disasters. She holds a Master of Divinity from Claremont School of Theology and a BA from Texas Christian University. Caroline is also the first repeat presenter in the Faithful Resilience series, and you'll soon see why. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold.
Thank you, Avery. It is truly a delight to be back with y'all to give an updated version of this presentation, which is so prescient. As we watch the news every day, it seems there's another climate disaster affecting our neighbors around the world who are all part of this human family. And Week of Compassion, as the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, has a mission to work with partners to alleviate suffering throughout the world. And that suffering is increasingly caused by the effects of the climate crisis on neighbors who are experiencing food shortages, who are experiencing disasters, who are made more vulnerable to the other crises of poverty because of the effects of this climate crisis. And so we are grateful to be in relationship and partnership with Creation Justice Ministries. We have an audience, a community gathered here this evening that really spans the US. I was scrolling through the chat there, and we go from New England across to the Pacific Northwest, down to Southern California, and then across the South to my Texas and over to Alabama. And I'm sure there are some others that I missed as I was scrolling. And nowhere are we immune. Nowhere are we escaping the effects of our changing climate and the harm that we have done to our earth, this good earth that God has created. And so as we ask this question of how can we be hubs of resilience, how can our congregations be places to bring hope and healing in the midst of that crisis, we know it is an urgent moment. I know you can't read all the small, tiny words and numbers on this slide. That's intentional. This is to give you an emotional reaction of why we are here and why this is urgent. Although those of you who have joined probably need no reminding of why this is urgent. That in the top left corner of this image, we see the changing patterns of rainfall, with too much rain in some parts of our country and not nearly enough in other parts. We see changing average temperatures and average high temperatures on the bottom left of the screen, which exacerbates the wildfire seasons. That is no longer a season, feels like it's year round now. I was speaking today with congregations in Texas, in Taylor County around Abilene, and they said, we just need the heat and the wind to stop, but that's not going to happen because it's May in West Texas. On the bottom right, you see the forecast for this year's hurricane season, yet another above average season. And this is with an increased average that came out last year. And the top right, the increase in the number of billion-dollar disasters over the last 30 or so years. And some of that has to do with where we build and how we build and whether we are maintaining our infrastructures and taking steps to reduce risk in our community. But it also shows an increase in the frequency and severity of these climate-related disasters. A recent model put out by First Street Foundation found that 1 in 6 households in the US has significant risk to exposure of wildfire. And within the next 30 years, that's going to increase to about 1 in 5 households in the US. And a 2018 report, National Climate Assessment report, says that every region of the United States will have significant impact from climate disasters and climate impact, whether that's droughts that curb hydropower and limit food production, to saltwater tainting drinking water across many communities, especially in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and sea level rise that is affecting so many of our coastal communities. We are in a moment where the church must respond, because our neighbors are hurting and will continue to be harmed by the impact of this crisis. I see these reports, these moments, as our warnings, in the same way that in Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh receives a warning about the 7 fat cow years and the 7 skinny cow years, and that 7 years of abundance will get wiped out by the 7 years of drought and famine. And those who surround the Pharaoh, those who are supposed to be the wise ones, the sages of Pharaoh's court, can't interpret this dream. I think won't interpret the dream is probably more likely, are willfully ignorant about what this dream and warning means. But Joseph, faithful to God, sees the dream for what it means and convinces Pharaoh to take action, to store grain, to prepare during the 7 years of plenty, so that not only can the people of Egypt survive through the 7 years of famine, they also can serve those who come seeking assistance. That when others come, when Joseph's own family comes asking for help, there is enough for all. We are receiving our dream, our Pharaoh's dream. And so it is on us to decide how we will respond faithfully. Every disaster is unique. Every community is affected differently based on the disaster itself, the quirks and particularities of the community, what else is going on in the world at the time of the disaster. And yet all disasters tend to follow these same phases. There's warning, sometimes long warning, sometimes the general warning that we have just talked about. There's the impact of the actual disaster, that emergency moment when those who are specially trained are rescuing, are providing immediate care for the community. These are the capital F, capital R, first responders, and those who have received specific training to protect life and property in the moment of a disaster. Then we very quickly move into relief, which is helping to meet basic human needs: shelter, food, water, medical care, spiritual and emotional care. There's a period of assessment, figuring out who has been affected and how, and what kinds of needs do they have and will they have, and what kinds of resources are available to move the community toward recovery, and what needs to be called on from outside the community. And then we move into a phase of long-term recovery, the least celebrated, the longest phase of the disaster cycle, but the time when communities are actually rebuilding their social fabrics, their infrastructure, their homes, their businesses, and their communities. And hopefully this leads communities to a place of new normal, of potentially a more resilient normal for the future. And ideally, there is mitigation and preparation happening throughout the whole of this cycle. Undeniably, through the entirety of the cycle, churches are vital. This is one of our Disciples of Christ congregations in Port Aransas, Texas. And after Hurricane Harvey, They opened very quickly as a distribution center for basic supplies. They had some minimal damage to the building, but they were still able to use the majority of it. And so they converted every square inch of that place into storage and distribution facility. But then they didn't stop there, because they recognized through those phases of disaster, the needs of the community would change. And so as they started to hear and learn about the ways that folks in their community were being affected by the trauma of the storm, they used some of their building space as a counseling center, and they provided free or subsidized trauma counseling services to folks who had been affected first by Hurricane Harvey, and then by some subsequent storms, and then by the pandemic, and then by the winter storm of 2021, and found that there were so many places of overlapping trauma for those folks of their community, that this was a sustained need, that they needed to help make their community more whole and more resilient. So they've continued offering that service as a ministry of their church. There was a report that came out a few years back from the University of Texas at Arlington, a couple of researchers there, that looked at the impact of non-governmental entities who are serving after disasters. So this is faith-based and non-faith-based, but all non-governmental. And they highlighted the swiftness that these non-governmental entities had in their response, the flexibility they had in their response, the trust that they had in communities because of their presence prior to the disaster, and their ability then to engage with marginalized communities that had low levels of trust with local, state, and federal government. They noted also that over 3/4 of those entities who were surveyed believed that had they not been active, providing the services that they did in the locations and to the community that they did, those services would not have been provided, or would not have been provided in those communities. There's some recognition of this within the disaster recovery community. And so there is increased effort to build networks of congregations, of houses of worship, of local community organizations, seeing that we all have a role to play, and that these places that are embedded in the community, congregations that are already part of the fabric of a community, can be vital places of service and places of connection following a disaster. Throughout those many phases of disaster, there are different needs. And so as congregations start to think about how we can respond well to our neighbors, we have to think about, where do we plug in best? And maybe, like in Port Aransas, that's in multiple places, or maybe it's in one specific task that becomes a real focus of your particular congregation. It might also mean that in some moments you're taking lead on a particular type of response, and in other places you're looking at where you can partner, where you can support other community organizations, other congregations that are doing good work to complement the work that you are able to do as congregations. I'll give you a moment just to look over some of those example needs. For some congregations, those first few days and weeks will be the time when the energy is high, and the ability of a congregation to respond quickly is suited for the moment, and they may provide mass care. That might be, as in this picture, providing shelter, overnight shelter, respite shelter, cooling centers, charging stations, places where people can come and use a computer or get a cup of coffee, or figure out where they can go next. It might be feeding ministries. It might be helping people connect to medical services or to the governmental services that are being offered in the municipality. Those immediate needs that need very quick mobilization. It's fast, it's intense, it's usually only for a few days or a few weeks, but it is all hands on deck during that time. Other congregations may be more suited to doing distribution of supplies, either in those first few days, through partnerships with food banks, through like the CWS Church World Service cleanup bucket program, or it may be through a clothing closet or furniture bank, or other supply ministry that you already have happening at your congregation. Or it may be farther along in the recovery. It may be helping to identify who needs what kinds of physical materials and helping to do the logistics of connecting those folks to agencies and organizations that can fill those needs. Distribution is almost always done best in partnership because we can access resources most effectively, most efficiently when we do it at scale. And we can make sure the right things are going to the right people, to folks who actually need it. And so distribution can be scaled at many different levels, depending on the capacity of your congregation, and can be done almost entirely through connection with other organizations to say, we're going to connect with the food bank, or we're going to connect with another organization we know will do effective distribution. Churches also can be, and congregations and houses of worship can be really helpful in identifying locations that need distribution, of lifting up, this neighborhood is not getting what it needs. This neighborhood is getting too much. Can we redirect resources to places where folks have need? Throughout all of the phases of a disaster, spiritual and emotional care are crucial, and it's an offering that is somewhat unique to houses of worship, to congregations, the ability to accompany people through a moment of crisis, to offer liturgical spaces and rituals and trained pastoral care, and just accompaniment through compassionate accompaniment through what is a really overwhelming process, to say, you know what, let me walk with you through this. I'll help you find all your paperwork. I'll help you sort through all of this. That especially churches that take some time to learn the processes of applying for different kinds of assistance, of what it means to do the insurance process and do the FEMA process, and to track all the receipts and all the paperwork. If you've got some folks who are detail oriented and are willing to do some of that advanced learning, and then to help walk people along through that process, can be incredibly helpful. Because if you've ever been through a traumatic event, or if you've ever been to a really unexpected doctor's appointment and you walk out and you don't remember anything the doctor said, and you're really glad you had somebody with you who was able to hear and take notes and help you process what you've just heard. Same goes for a post-disaster process. To have somebody else keeping track of some of the details with you can be really helpful. Congregations can also be an incredible asset through long-term recovery, through this rebuilding phase, both physical rebuilding and that kind of communal rebuilding of what it means to feel cohesive and safe and resilient as a community. partly that's because churches are there. Churches are part of the community for the long term, so we can be there and be engaged for the long term because we're not having to come in from elsewhere. We're already rooted. And if we're already rooted in relationship across the community, then we will be engaged in long-term recovery quite naturally. For some, again, that will be active rebuilding. It'll be teams that do repair work. I saw Presbyterians, I saw UCC folks, I saw American Baptists, all as part of our community tonight. And all three of those disaster ministries denominationally have repair and rebuild as an aspect of what you do through long-term recovery, supporting communities. That's not the only need. There's also need for, as I said, emotional and spiritual care. There's need to help folks restore their livelihoods, to make plans for what does it mean to relocate, a myriad of other ways that we can support communities by connecting in to what are often called long-term recovery groups, community-wide coalitions, tables, organizations that help to facilitate recovery for those who don't have the resources or access to resources to recover on their own. Throughout it all, congregations can also play an important role in advocacy. And this extends beyond the long-term recovery into that new normal and into that preparation, that we can help to amplify the voices of those who may be overlooked through a disaster recovery, those who have been marginalized and those who have been made vulnerable by our inequitable social structures, by the systemic racism that is embedded in all of our cities and towns, and that the church, that our houses of worship and congregations can engage in pressuring our communities and our governments to distribute resources equitably and to keep in mind the bigger picture of recovery, which is making more resilient communities. And so it's advocating for things like hazard mitigation as we are recovering, to see that resources are distributed equitably. The picture you see here is from the Northeast Action Collective, which is an organization in Northeast Houston, advocating especially around drainage issues. We're a city that floods, and certain parts of the city flood worse than other parts of the city. And part of that is that the drainage infrastructure has not been equitably constructed over the past many decades. And so this group has been really working toward improvements in that infrastructure to create more equity and to reduce risk for future flooding in these communities that have repeatedly been damaged by disasters. We can also be advocates around building practices. What gets built where do we have developments? What kinds of requirements are we putting on new construction to make them more resilient and to mitigate against climate impact? What building codes are we enforcing? What weatherization are we promoting and making available to homeowners in our area? What other ways can community cohesion and community action push our local governments to take a long view as we are using disaster recovery monies to create green spaces, to create plans that will reduce risk, hopefully mitigate against some of the climate impacts, and bring equity across our communities. As you saw on that cycle, along new normal, it also said preparation. And we should be preparing at all times, but especially as we lead into disasters and as we recover, we should be preparing so that we can reduce risk and so that we can be better suited and better positioned to help our neighbors. I think about disaster preparedness in three general ways: preparing our individuals and families within our congregations so that they can reduce the risk to themselves and to their homes and property. Preparing our church properties, so we can reduce risk, and preparing our church operations so that in the event of a disaster, in that moment of crisis, we can keep functioning as a church. One of the most basic things I ask of pastors often is, do you and all of your elders or deacons or leaders, whatever lay leaders you have, your prayer teams, have access to contact information for all of your people if you are not able to get to the church and if you are not able to access the internet? It's amazing how many pastors no longer have that information at their fingertips. And so making sure that we can keep doing the work of the church, even in the midst of a crisis. And then we're preparing to respond to our neighbors, responding to the needs that will arise and that we can help respond to. The first two, as I said, are really about risk reduction. And so they are sort of focused on what are the hazards, what are the risks, how can we prevent harm. The third is really focused more on strengths. It's looking at what are our assets and how can we use those to respond to needs and harm. So to first assess risk, you got to know what your likely risks are. And like I said, we've got folks from all across this country, and so the risks are going to be different everywhere. For all of you, actually, house fire is the greatest risk that faces your people. But as far as climate impact and climate disasters, those will vary from region to region. And so thinking about what is most likely and what is going to have the greatest impact, human impact, property impact, and operational impact. How you respond will be different based on whether it's an event that's going to have low property impact but high human impact, such as a mass casualty event, or if it's going to have high human impact, high property impact, and high operational impact, like a multi-day citywide flood. When you assess what your impacts are, you multiply that by the probability, you prioritize what you plan for based on what has that total risk. There are many resources that you can use to help determine what those risks are. Your state, county, and city emergency management offices or agencies do that assessment regularly and are often very eager to share that information with congregations about what they have identified as the most likely disasters. Ready.gov has some great tools, as well as Red Cross. You'll see that link there, redcross.org. Get help how to prepare for emergencies. You can use their interactive map to see what is most likely in your area. There's also this great tool called riskfactor.com. They just launched the fire factor component of that. It used to just be a flood factor tool, but you can put in a specific address and see your current risk and what the anticipated risk is for your area in the next 30 years as we try to account for the impacts of a changing climate. As you look at all those risks, part of being a community of faith is that we're not just about ourselves, that we are about our communities. So it may not be that your church building is in an area of high flood risk, but a few blocks away, the neighborhood might be. And so thinking about what are the vulnerabilities that surround your congregation? What are the risks that the folks around you might face? What are the unique needs that your immediate community or the communities you have relationship with might face after a disaster? Do you have strong relationships with communities where English is not the primary language? That presents extraordinary challenge in the moment of a disaster in terms of getting warning, in terms of knowing where to go to receive services, to be able to access and navigate the process for those services, all kinds of access issues there. Do you have an aging population where most of your members or most of the folks in your immediate neighborhood would be at high risk if there's a power outage, because many use CPAP machines or have oxygen machines, or would just be at high risk if they couldn't run their air conditioning in July in Houston? Are there other particular factors that will make things more difficult for the communities you have connection with, and to think about how disasters would exacerbate those needs and how you might respond to them? And as you think about how you might respond, do that from a place of giftedness, from a place of where God has particularly provided your congregation with resources, with charisms, with passion, and think about assets in a really broad way as you're starting to think about how your church can meet the specific needs of your community. Think about, what physical resources do you have in terms of your building, in terms of the supplies of your building, in terms of the supplies that are available through your congregation? Do you have lots of people who are tradespeople or who have, garages full of tools? Do you have lots of educators? Do you lean on the professions and skills of your people? Think through the assets of your existing ministries. I mentioned earlier, the distribution kinds of things, your food pantries, your medical supply closets, but do you have a relationship with your school? Do you have a mentorship program? Do you have a school within your congregation? Do you have prayer ministries or ministries with elderly neighbors? Do you have ministries that connect you with other parts of town or with other ministry partners who would be engaged in meeting needs for those who would be vulnerable after disasters? As you start to map all of that out, think about, what partnerships might you need to strengthen? What information do you need to learn about the people of your congregation? And what partnerships might you need to build? What kinds of relationships are currently missing? Do you not know who's in the neighborhood around you? Do you not have connection with the businesses that are in your neighborhood or the community leaders who are part of your neighborhood? Map those ties as weak ties, as moderate ties, and as strong ties, and identify a few that you can take to the next level, that you can strengthen, because really all disaster response work is based in relationship. We do have some tools in the Congregational Preparedness Guide that Week of Compassion provides to disciple congregations, and we'll share the PDF of that, maybe a Word document. We'll share a document of that congregational guide, and in the appendix are a number of assessment tools to help you think through what resources you have in terms of equipment, in terms of facilities, in terms of your partners and relationships. We also have a great resource in a new platform called Willing to Respond. It's an online network that was launched earlier this year by the Church Responds, the Disaster Ministries of the United Church of Christ, and the Disaster Ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And congregations can register as saying, yes, we want to be able to respond. We want to get more ready for disasters. Put us on this list. And then your denominational ministry representative can help to connect you to other churches in your area, to other resources, to organizations that are doing disaster recovery work in your community, and to provide communication and resources to help you get more ready, both ready in terms of individuals, ready in terms of a congregation, and ready to respond to your neighbors. And that is willingtorespond.org. A number of other resources I want to highlight before we turn to Q&A. FEMA has some great resources for house of worship and faith preparedness. They have a whole host of resources on general preparedness, but specifically for houses of worship, they've done some great work thinking through different types of disasters and how folks can prepare. National VOAD is National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. It is a network of 70 plus disaster response and recovery organizations, some faith-based, some not, that collaborate and communicate to work together and strengthen our ability to respond and recover for disasters. There's a resource library on National VOAD's website, and within that library is an inventory of preparedness resources. So you can do the deep dive into that inventory, many of which come from denominational ministries. You've already seen the link to creationjustice.org. There are some fabulous resources for taking this into the congregation and rooting it in our theological lives and in our faith community as not just something that we should do, but something that is part of who we are as people of faith. weekofcompassion.org/prepare is where you will find the disciple-specific resources, as well as that next link under disciples.org. We have curated some resources from other faith-based and governmental partners. And then I just want to lift up Green Chalice, which is our disciple climate action ministry, and would encourage you, if you're not already connected through your own denominational climate justice ministries, to figure out who that is for you. Green Chalice would probably be helpful. If you can't figure it out, reach out to them. They probably know who your point of contact is. The last resource I lift up here is a little dated. We need to do an update of the book, but the book Help and Hope, Disaster Preparedness and Response Tools for Congregations, published by Chalice Press, has chapters from different disaster response professionals, from pastors who have lived through pastoring through disaster, and has all kinds of different reflections and tools to help you think through what it would mean for your congregation to respond to disasters. With all of that, there's a lot of information and it can feel overwhelming. One of the things that I think is so powerful in that Genesis 41 story that we talked about at the beginning is that not only does Pharaoh hear what Joseph says about the dream, he's willing to act. And in ways that probably were not very popular, because storing up food probably didn't go over well with a lot of people. But he was willing to take action, and that prepared them for a better future, a more resilient future. And so I wonder what things you can commit to doing today, whether that is reaching out to your disaster ministry from your congregational setting, your denominational setting, whether it's doing a full walkthrough of your church building and thinking about what assets do we have and what risks are there for the congregation. Maybe it's identifying a point of contact in your congregation who might pull together a disaster response team. Maybe it's reaching out to your county emergency management to see what trainings are available, or just to start making that relationship and building that relationship. We do have a 10 steps document, 10 easy steps to become more prepared as a congregation on weekofcompassion.org/prepare. So if you need some other ideas on what to do, check that out. For the next 2 weeks, I'm available to you. After that, I'll be on maternity leave for a little bit. But please feel free to reach out to me if you have further questions or would like to be pointed in the direction of your own denominational disaster response and preparedness ministries.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Caroline. Thanks for that presentation. All of the just excellent resources. The theological grounding was wonderful. I've never thought about the Joseph story in that way. And I'm going to be chewing on that for a while. Just so grateful for what you've brought to us here today. Please, if you have questions for Caroline, drop them in the Q&A function. I've harvested up a couple that have come through. But actually, I want to start with a question of my own for you, Caroline, which is about FEMA and kind of FEMA's response to disasters. There's been some studies shown in the last couple of years that often when FEMA responds to disasters, the response is inequitable, usually along racial lines. And what that means is in the wake of disasters, there's essentially a transfer of wealth from low-income communities of color to high-income, often developers who are profiting off of, building high-rise condos where there used to be communities. So 2 questions here, I guess. The first is, how at Week of Compassion do you all ensure that your response to disasters is just from a racial equity perspective? And then from an advocacy perspective, how can we work with FEMA as communities of faith to ensure that disaster response is equitable?
Yeah, wonderful questions. And great timing. We actually are having our board meeting next week, and one of the agenda items is to present them with a racial equity assessment that we've been doing for the last 9 months, knowing that we swim in the waters of our culture and of a church as disciples of Christ that was born as part of westward expansion and within a context of disaster recovery that, as you have so aptly named, is often very inequitable and actually exacerbates inequalities. And so we are actively looking at how our engagement can be anti-racist in our disaster recovery work. We've been doing that in many ways for years, but to really take some intentional steps to have outside auditors come and look at our programs. So that's one piece, is just trying to be honest with ourselves. Some of it is looking at how we can partner with local communities to support work that is intentional about meeting the needs of communities that are most vulnerable. So one of the examples is another partner in Houston, West Street Recovery, that focuses on 4 zip codes that are historically marginalized, have seen massive disinvestment. It's actually the Northeast Action Collective is tied in there as well. And really intentionally directing our funding to communities where the disaster recovery mechanisms writ large may not be applicable. It's also investing in projects that are focused on building community wealth and power and that have long-term vision. So one of the projects we're really active in right now is called the Tornado Survivors Pathways to Homeownership Project in Dayton, Ohio, responding to the 2019 tornado outbreak that included the destruction of more than 1,500 rental units and trying to restore affordable housing stock in Dayton for first-time homeowners who were displaced from rental housing by the tornadoes. So really multi-layered kind of community stabilization project that we're excited about there. On the kind of more advocacy side, that's one of the roles that I think the church can help play in a number of ways, is again, helping to lift up, hey, this community is not getting the information, this neighborhood needs some more specific outreach, or outreach in a different way, or outreach through a trusted partner. And that is often through congregations that are rooted in those communities. That accompaniment piece, so much of what we have seen with the inequity of especially individual assistance from FEMA is about folks not having access to the process, not knowing that they can qualify, and having difficulty navigating the actual application and appeals processes. So having advocates who walk alongside and accompany and help say, no, this is really damaged, we need to appeal this, to be a sort of an outside observer of the process can help folks get the full amount they're entitled to through the existing processes. We have also seen success in advocacy over the last several years with FEMA processes that have changed around what kinds of documentation people can use to prove home ownership. So we saw lots of issues around unclear titles and heirship properties, and places where multiple family members were listed on a title, or a deceased family member is listed on a title, and that would kick people out of the system. And so that disproportionately affected communities of color. And many years of advocacy from the church and from the disaster response and recovery community has resulted in some pretty significant policy changes that are hopefully helping to address that problem.
Yeah. Oh, that's great, Caroline. And one question that has come up in the chat that relates to this, and that I think comes up frequently, is how do we move communities from just a service model to a service and advocacy model? I think advocacy can be uncomfortable for communities. It's new. It can be perceived as partisan. So how, what would be your recommendations for how to move a community from service to advocacy?
Yeah, and I know I saw that come through the chat too, and that the concern around how to do it without crossing boundaries. And I am not a legal scholar, so I'm not even going to begin to tell you the kind of tax implications and how to keep on the right side of the law. Church and tax law has some really great resources on that. As far as moving people, I have found that when we talk about a specific situation, a specific story, this is the community in Northeast Houston, and when it rains consistently for an hour, all their streets flood, while the rest of the Houston area is not flooding. So let's look at why that is. Let's look at the drainage that's not getting cleared. Let's look at the fact that they still have ditch drainage instead of a sewer system drainage. People can connect to that specificity in a way that's saying, we're going to advocate for just infrastructure, becomes politicized, where Miss Gloria's house becomes inaccessible every time it rains in Houston. We need to do something about that. Is much more personal, and people can relate to it, and becomes a really practical conversation instead of a theoretical and potentially political conversation. I think we also just have to be upfront and honest that things that our communities have done in the past have had consequences. Some of them were intended, some of them were maybe unintentional, but they have had consequences, and this is what we're living with. And how do we make life better for our neighbors and with our neighbors? Disasters in some ways provide a moment, a brief moment, where we can talk about those impacts in really visceral ways. And it's really obvious some of the disparities in our communities that maybe are not as obvious at other times, especially when there are sort of long-standing political divisions in a community as well. Disasters for a brief moment can suspend those divisions.
Yeah, great, great. Thank you, Caroline. Please, everyone, give a virtual round of applause for Caroline for her presentation, for your good work. Blessings on your work, Caroline, and on your forthcoming maternity leave. Thank you for us. By way of closing, I'll note in the chat that Carlos Martinez dropped a link to a program that Creation Justice Ministries is co-hosting on June 1st with the American Meteorological Society. So scroll up and look at that. This is just a great time, a great opportunity to hear from a variety of faith perspectives as well as science perspectives on how we can build a weather-ready nation. Presenters include Dr. Carlos Martinez, who's here with us today, Bruce Jones from Midland Radio, Reverend Susan Hendershot with Interfaith Power and Light, and Marcus T. Coleman Jr., who is the director for the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships for the Department of Homeland Security. So check that out to plug in more. I also wanted to address a question from someone asking about United Methodist resources on this. And Caroline, would I be right to say that the United Methodist Committee on Relief would be the place to look for that? Great. So I can't remember who asked about that, but check out UMCOR, or the United Methodist Committee on Relief, which is the United Methodist department, similar to what Caroline is directing.
And as far as I'm aware, every conference within the United Methodist Church has a conference disaster coordinator who would probably be your most immediate contact. They also have national staff that could direct you to the right person. Feel free to reach out to me if you have trouble finding who those people are.
Great. And I see some questions about the chat. We will not send you the chat, but we will send you all of the resources that are in the chat. So I hope that is sufficient for you, because there are a lot, and we'll be sure to send those all in a follow-up email along with the recording. So thanks everyone for being with us tonight. Thanks again, Caroline, for your presentation. Blessings, and may you all go out and be disciples of faithful resilience. Thank you.